Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello, I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the philosophical concept of Plato, of the philosopher king. With me is Pierre Grimes, who is the author of Philosophical Midwifery, as well as Socrates and Jesus, A Dialogue in Heaven, and many other books. Pierre is also the founder of the Noetic Society and a specialist in ancient philosophy. Welcome once again, Pierre.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Mine.
We come across the philosopher king in Plato's Republic, and it's something of, you almost could think of it as a thought experiment, a philosophical ideal of a wise ruler.
True. That is the way it's often discussed.
And
I would just make a slight change.
Yeah.
A ruler of oneself, not a political ruler.
All the more interesting.
Yes.
A master of oneself, which is really what mastery is all about.
Yes.
Ultimately. And I gather that Plato even provides some descriptions regarding the preparation and training of the philosopher king.
True. Shall we explore it?
Yes.
All right. See, after Plato has already discussed what a philosopher is, and that is someone who has already achieved through the dialectic and has matched his experience in the dialectic with meditation, has seen the ultimate nature of reality and within himself, the question now comes in the Republic, how is it possible to bring people to this? Is there any way in which we can train people to bring them to this, to become philosophers in the way in which we just described?
Mm-hmm. Which really we're talking about, in effect, mystics who have a hand in the practical world.
That's true. And the way in which Socrates in the Republic says it, well, you know what that means? That means we're going to try to show how we can bring someone from Hades to heaven. And he says, therefore, he said, let's start. There are 5 studies that have to be done with a 6th in the background. Study of arithmetic, geometry, solid geometry, astronomy, and music. And aside, next comes the dialectic. Now, with the new insight into Plato that's based upon the Balboa translations, you can have
unpublished. These are translations by one of your colleagues.
Oh, yes. Yes. A very fine gentleman and his wife, they work together.
Yes.
Maria.
Instituting or remembering or reawakening the emphasis on the self.
Yes.
In the work of not just Plato, but many ancient writings.
That's right. That's right. Proclus, Plotinus, especially Homer. So then, now the key to understanding these so-called studies is to recognize that he's talking on 2 levels, which means whatever he says about arithmetic, he will dismiss. Same thing about geometry, same thing about astronomy, same thing about solid geometry. In other words, he's going to dismiss the way it's normally understood and give a philosophical understanding of what it really means on the highest level.
Yeah.
So therefore, he says, for arithmetic, he says, we need to study what, after all, is the one itself. Let's change it again. What, after all, is the one self, not itself? The one self.
The one self. That is the essential study necessary for every philosopher.
who's one of these who follow this curious game that we're talking about?
Yeah.
So therefore, what's interesting, you see, therefore, in talking about that subject, the one self, he only introduces the idea of self in a secondary sense and explores what he means by the kind of one which is going to be connected with the self. Therefore, he says, look here, you have to understand the kind of one we're talking about that relates to the self. So therefore, he opens up discussion about what kind of one that is. And he says, by the way, the kind of one we're talking about, it must be the same everywhere. So analogically, the self must be everywhere the same.
Yes.
So right away he's working on the highest vision of the self.
Yes.
So therefore he has a discussion about, don't bother with trying to talk about fractions or addition or these kinds of things that they do in arithmetic. That's not what we're doing. We need to study what kind of one is most appropriately associated and shows intrinsically the interconnection with the noble idea of self. That's arithmetic. When I used to teach philosophy at a college, I always started out by saying, John, could anybody teach arithmetic this way? No.
You wouldn't get very far in number theory.
No, right. Then he says, well, you know what, now that we've done a good job on that, the next study is geometry. And of course, his first description is to say, we're not talking about what geometricians do. We're not going to talk that way.
Yeah.
We're going to talk on the philosophical side. And he said, therefore, what we really want to do is to urge our philosophers to awaken the intellect. See, the intellect isn't often used, only occasionally used, because that's the vehicle you need in order to gain an insight into ultimate reality. So he said the way to wake up the intellect is you have to decide to get a vision of the good, the idea of the good, brilliant light of being.
That's geometry.
That's geometry.
Because as is well known, in the entrance to Plato's Academy, it says, none shall enter here who does not understand geometry.
Right. And you better have your Republic in your back pocket to know you're not going to learn geometry.
Kind of a paradox.
Yeah. Well, see, once he lays that out, then he has the next problem. Necessarily in this teaching of the Philosopher King. There's a difficulty, because Agathon at this point says, Glaucon at this point says...
these are Plato's companions.
Yes.
Or
yes.
Socrates' companions in the narrative.
Right. And Glaucon says, well, what's the next study? Should it not be... astronomy?
Yeah.
And Socrates says, no. Solid geometry. Now, the way he describes solid geometry will cause you to smile.
I can imagine.
Here it comes.
Because obviously the Platonic solids are well known to everybody.
Yes.
Solid geometry associated with Plato is classic.
Yes. Yes. He said, we'll put aside what they do. He said, you know, the difficulty in studying solid geometry is that you can't get any teachers. There are no teachers. Very difficult. You can't get a state to support that teaching because everyone has their own view about the self. So therefore, what you really need to do is find teachers, but it's very difficult to find them. And do you know why? Because everybody thinks they already know what the self is. So what you really need to do is shop around, if you possibly can, to find a teacher of the self. If you do, one of the marks he brings up is the necessity to look for charm. Now, when that came up years ago, I said to myself, what has that got to do? Charm? and teachers of this kind of search for the self, to know the self. And by the way, he says, knowledge of the self is the goal of solid geometry, knowledge of self. Mm-hmm. So I went in the text into the Greek, and I made a list of all the occasions where he uses the word charm. Mm-hmm. And most often, translators don't use the same word. Yeah. Therefore, you're not going to find it in an average translation. But what you can collect them together, and it is that kind of personality that allowed Socrates to engage with multiple people, and they don't get mad and they don't get upset with him. Mm-hmm. He's very gracious, and he can talk to anybody with his style or charm.
Until the city council of Athens decides that he is corrupting the youth.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Why, that's called solid geometry.
Well, I imagine by referring to the study of the self as solid geometry, Plato, give me feedback if this is correct. Plato is known for expressing the idea that the ideal forms of solid geometry exist, but not in the physical reality. They exist in a sort of supersensual reality. Mm-hmm. And when he says that the self is part of this study of solid geometry, he's implying that the real self that we're talking about, the one self, also doesn't exist in physical reality. It exists in I'm going to call it a supersensual realm.
Very well said, yes. Yes, and the whole game is how do you get there, and how it can become part of you, and how can you use it in your everyday world? Mm-hmm. Well, astronomy. Well, in the same way, he says, by the way, we're not going to follow those people who lie on their back and look up in the heavens and stare at the heavens. We're not going to do that. We're not going to follow their patterns. He said they're great patterns that they have made about the heavens. Dalius has great diagrams and works. We're not concerned with that. Mm-hmm. We're not concerned with astronomy.
Nor, I presume, astrology.
That's right. So therefore, what does he mean?
Yeah.
So he says, well, you know what? The real study of astronomy is that you have to find the truth in true numbers. Because you have to make sure you're dealing with rest and motion in numbers, and analogy, which you call, another word for analogy is somatria, which is symmetry. That's astronomy. Excuse me, what is that? Finding in true numbers being, calls it being, rest and motion. Uh-huh. And symmetry, and analogy. See, one of the problems, if you want to understand the brilliant light of being, which is being, is that it is a dynamic. It's alive, living, intelligible, and whatever you want to call it, right? Yes. It is not static, yet it is always the same, and therefore it is in rest and, in one way, motion.
Yes.
So he's introducing that idea in that great study of astronomy.
Okay. Can I give you a little my own thoughts on that? I'm pretty sure in the ancient world, it was assumed that there were heavenly spheres.
Oh, yes.
And these heavenly spheres are associated with music, the music of the spheres, associated with astronomy because each of the planets was associated with one of those spheres as they move around. But it also was associated with a kind of a notion of an ascent of the soul through the heavenly spheres.
True.
And when he's talking about rest and motion, he's sort of suggesting in symmetry the need to develop a philosophical understanding of the principles that underlie their thinking about the heavenly spheres and therefore the uplifting of the soul to the higher realms.
True. Taking just what you said, there's always a difference between a description of causes and effects and the conditions that allow those causes and effects to exist. So he took what you said and he says, wait a minute, the condition for that to be there must be something that allows it, in the way in which you just described it, to exist.
Yeah.
That's what we're going to study.
Motion and rest.
And he's saying, in order to understand that, that's really a reflection of ultimate reality. And therefore, you're really talking about the self as manifesting itself in the brilliant light of being, which has that property of fast and slow, dynamic interchange that is so magnificent.
He's always coming back to first principles.
Always. The condition. Yeah. So he always does that again and again.
Which is, I would think, even in the political sense, a wise ruler who looks for first principles in every situation is likely to make good decisions.
Yes, yes. Now, music, he calls it harmony or music. Is we're not going to pluck instruments. We're not going to deal with that. That's not our concern. He says, we're interested in something more significant. As a matter of fact, we want to deal with the kinds of problems that you have in geometry, trying to gain an insight into ultimate reality. Though he doesn't say that, he just says, we're going to look at problems just the way we encountered the problems in geometry. And of course, with geometry was gaining an insight into ultimate reality, the brilliant light of being. And now he now has to say something interesting. And he says, it comes down to when you hear something in the symphonies, the goal is to try to be able to pierce and grasp that intelligibility of the symphony, of those harmonies. It's not getting caught up in the music, but to be able to identify, and now he comes up with 3 terms, which are rather curious. He says, you have to get, you have to study equals, doubles, and a higher view of analogy. Well, what does that mean? He said, wait a minute. He adds to it. And you have to see that in true numbers. It's a total puzzle. However, when you finally get into Plato and you ask yourself, where in Plato does he open up these subjects? In the Timaeus, he works out the mathematics of the Greek diatonic scale, which also matches the intervals in the planetary system. But they are made of 3 mean analogies, arithmetic, geometric, and harmonic. Therefore, he sees these 3 analogies as integral to the very structure and the harmony of the whole universe. Therefore, you have to know, now, when doubles and equals, where do you get that? By the way, in the second hypothesis, in the Parmenides, he talks about true numbers. The Parmenides.
Now, just to clarify, the Parmenides and Timaeus that you've just mentioned, are they, do you know if they're written before or after the Republic?
I don't even open that door.
Okay.
I don't, that doesn't make any difference to me.
All right.
But that a lot of people do, and I appreciate their concern. But
okay, as far as you're concerned, it's just one large body of work, all interrelated.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because, so you see, the problem in the second hypothesis is, as you consider the brilliant light of being, what can you infer from it as a set of the most minimum ideas?
Mm-hmm.
And he says, you know what? Only 3. Being, ousia, and difference. Those are the 3. With those, everything else can be understood. Now, ousia, I use the word because it's the Greek and it's not translated properly.
Yeah.
That's the power that man has and the universe has to reflect upon oneself.
Mm-hmm. Self-reflection.
That property.
Yes.
Right? That activity or that activity. See?
Yeah.
So, if you take those 3, he does. He takes these 3 ideas.
What was the first one?
The one, ousia, and difference.
Yeah, okay.
See, without difference, you can't make distinctions.
Right. Unity, self-reflection, I'll call it,
all right,
and difference.
Right.
Right.
That's
real basic stuff. Real basic.
Now, he says, look here, the parameters of that, if you take them in pairs, duals.
Yes.
That's what he mentioned in the study of music.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And then you have to see how they pairs can be in doubles.
Mm-hmm.
So the parameters of those 3, taking them as pairs, and then generate their possible combinations, well, then you can from those you can infer a set of numbers. Like in a pair presupposes 1, 2. Oh, there's another pair, 3, 4. Well, you can identify a set of numbers.
Mm-hmm.
These finite numbers, by the way, they exclude 5 and 7.
Oh.
The primary and the least numbers that fit the mean analogies of arithmetic, geometric, and harmonic mean analogies.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's probably pretty clear that coming out of the Pythagorean tradition, Plato was skilled at geometry and mathematics.
As a matter of fact, he mentions that in his work when he's talking in the Republic about music. He says, these are the Pythagoreans. We're doing what the Pythagoreans are doing. So you're absolutely correct on that.
Yeah.
That fits exactly what they were doing.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, well, you know what?
It's worth mentioning, I think, that the Pythagoreans must have shared Plato's emphasis on mysticism.
Oh, without a doubt. Yes. Then he says, you know what? All of these studies aren't worth much unless you can see their interrelationship and kinship. Oh, so now what do you have to do? You have to knit them together and see how they fit and see why they fit and the combinations that you bring them together.
Sure.
And he says, once you do that, then you're prepared to deal with the law of the mind.
Mm.
The law of the mind is that if you want to understand the mind, you must master dialectic.
And I suppose it's worth saying that we have a previous conversation that you and I have recorded on just that topic of philosophical dialectic.
Right.
Yeah.
And in his description of the dialectic in Plato's 7th book of the Republic, which is what we're quoting, it's so brief, it's only got two or three sentences.
Mm-hmm.
You can't use that to understand the dialectic. So that's the same way in which he always works.
Yeah. That's why you need to refer to some of the other dialogues.
Right, to plug them in so that you have a matrix where all of the things are interacting.
Mm-hmm. So your reading of Plato here is not so different from what some biblical scholars do when they look for particular words and where they occur each time.
Sure. Yes. Mm-hmm. And it must fit a meaningful progression of ideas.
Yeah.
So therefore, throughout this discussion, I have not mentioned the fact that throughout the whole is the frequent mention of the word self, 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 all the way through.
Yeah.
So therefore, when he finishes this, it looks like it's the end. But you see, what's most interesting about this game of philosophy is that if you think you understand some idea, one of the tests is whether or not you can equally understand with the same kind of precision its opposite, injustice. Therefore, in Book 8, 9, 10, you see, he now has to show with an equal kind of precision in thought the nature of injustice.
Yeah.
And that means he has to then show why it necessarily follows that there are going to be inhabitants in the allegory of the cave where there are prisoners spending the rest of their whole lives looking at the wall, much like many of us look at movies, and that's our life.
Yeah.
Right. So therefore, he then has to create a whole series of discussions and examples of how injustice emerges.
Well, especially, I should think, in that day and age where they didn't have a strong justice system. They lived in a time of rulers and tyrants and kings, and, there was a minimal amount of courts and accountability.
That's true.
And people sort of took it for granted, and I think many of the ancient Greek city-states sort of believe might makes right.
That's one of the theses in the first book of the Republic. That's one of the arguments that has to be disassembled.
Yeah.
Oh. So therefore, you see, in Book 9, he finishes all of that. And Socrates, our friend Glaucon says, Socrates, do you think this will ever come into existence? And that's where he makes that statement we mentioned before. No, he says, no. It's something that you use to contemplate. And in contemplating, that's what you want to bring to yourself.
It's a metaphor. He's using the idea of a political system and the ruling, the overship, lordship of a physical, of a political system as a metaphor for self-mastery.
That's right. Absolutely. So the last book, 10, is one of the examples where he recognizes the value of something but never explores it as he should have. Because in the beginning, therefore, of the last book, he says, by the way, dreams are pretty important. Matter of fact, it's only through dreams, that you can get knowledge of your past, gives insight into your present, and prepares you for your future, and prepares you for vision.
For vision.
Vision, yeah. But again, it would have been nice for someone to have said, one of his colleagues, excuse me, Socrates, I don't mean to hold you up, but many people don't conclude from a dream that they gain insights into their past, present, and future. Could you tell me how you do that?
Yeah.
Nothing. So he drops it and then it goes on.
Yeah. But Socrates was known to have said that he received a lot of inspiration from what he called his daimon.
Yes. The voice. Yes.
An inner voice. A particular inner voice.
And he also says it's from dreams and visions. So it would have been nice to have 5 or 6 of his dreams, but they're not in Plato.
Yeah.
No.
However, there is another work from that period about dream interpretation.
There is one great one, which isn't very often studied. Selenius is the gentleman, and I'm going to make sure you get a copy of it. And he opens it up, and he starts out by saying that, I'm somewhat embarrassed to talk about the obvious. But he's talking about how to understand dreams, and we follow the same principles in philosophical midwifery, which essentially is to, you read a dream as you would a great work. You respect it, every word. You don't interpret anything. But as you do with any great literature, you look for the nature of the problem. Where is the essential problem? Is it possible you can discover where it began? Is it possible then, by reflecting on the work, that there might be certain states of mind that occurred in the present as literature? Perhaps a hero at a key point is exhibiting certain inner states or feelings or states of mind that are key to his own psyche. And you might want to know, where did they begin? Why did he have that reaction to that particular experience? You go back into the story and you hope the author could pin that down, that its origin may have come from an early life experience. So therefore, a dream is an analogy. It provides you with insights into your present, past, and future. And the importance of it is to ask the person each time they have a dream, why are you having it now rather than last week? What's going on the last 24 hours that made this dream essential for your own growth? It must have that immediacy. Even though it's quite obvious in dream work that you can take dreams that people have had 10 or 20 years ago and still have a very fruitful analysis of the dream, but it won't have its impact on the moment. And so this way of understanding dreams is old.
How would you compare the ancient Greek model with the modern psychoanalytic approach to dreams?
2 steps. No interpretation. There goes Freud, there goes Jung. The individual is unique. Every dream, I've never seen the same dream twice. Every dream fits the uniqueness of the individual and their particular stage in life. Everybody needs help from their dream because the dream shows the intelligibility of their life and what they're facing and how they can use that in order to profitably make major decisions in their life. And since, by the way, this way of approaching it follows the same set of questions that vary according to the person here and there. Therefore, it is a dialectic. Since a dialectic is to follow in a procedure similar questions along similar patterns for similar causes.
So the philosopher kings are engaged in a rigorous philosophical examination of first principles and how they relate to each other in 5 different areas, all basically coming back to this mystical sense of the one self.
Beautifully said.
And on top of that, rational analysis, they are also expected to be familiar with the world of dreams and to be awake and alive to their dreams, which makes good sense when you consider we spend a third of our life sleeping.
Yes. And I've been doing dreams for 50 years or more. Every Friday night, I do dream reviews for our group. And they're all fascinating. They're all unique. Everyone is a challenge. You can't assume anything as you walk in. And therefore, you have to clear your mind of everything you think. And they are the person that's most significant in what they say and what they've written down. Matter of fact, I urge people, tape your dreams. Just do this once. Tape your dreams. Don't listen to them. A couple of hours later, recall it, but write it out. Then find an occasion for talking about it. But don't open the letter, your notes, or listen to the record. And you'll see progressively through those, you've lost great material for insights.
Oh?
Because the closer you are to the source, it's more vital. Mm-hmm. It's more true to the dream.
Dreams tend to fade.
Yeah.
Okay. But so we're envisioning a community of philosophers who come together. I gather the philosopher king is not a single ruler, but it's a community.
Well, we don't have any accurate picture of Plato's Academy. Uh-huh. There's a great book on Plato's Academy, name escapes me for some years. And he had a great article. He said, by the way, the Germans think the model of Plato's Academy is Heidelberg. The English are sure it's like Oxford, so on. Yeah. But literally, we don't know what they did there, other than these philosophers did their writing and had engaged, but there isn't any personal data.
Well, we can say some things about the ancient world. And one of them is that I think for the ancient Greeks and other ancient peoples, they were all more familiar with their dreams.
Oh, yes.
Dreams were just important across the ancient world.
Oh, I think you mentioned yesterday that you could recall the story that before physicians treated a patient.
Yeah.
They first had
the Asclepion sleep temples.
The sleep temples.
Yeah.
Yes. And there was one that was in a river, made of stone, like a ship.
Oh.
And that was the hospital. And patients came in to dream. That's where they did their dreams.
Arrive by boat.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah. And Homer, of course, has a great dream. Many dreams that are very significant. They can be analyzed, as I have. And they're very, very profound and meaningful in terms of the context of the drama that unfolds in the story.
I tend to think in our present era, we're all so busy. We pay less and less attention to our dreams.
To ourselves.
And to ourselves,
Yeah. Well, there's nothing more beautiful, and there's nothing more profound, there's nothing more wondrous than the self.
Yeah. Well, I gather that you don't find in Plato anything like that's the equivalent of yoga, meditative practices, postures.
No. Well, you see, we study Hatha Yoga as if that is yoga. But in the East, they have Raja Yoga, they have Jnana Yoga, they have Bhakti Yoga, they have a whole range.
Oh, yes, sure.
We center on the one and praise it and get people involved in it, and Kundalini Yoga. But they don't go into Raja Yoga, they don't get into Jnana Yoga.
Yeah.
So this is Jnana Yoga.
But yes, it certainly is.
In a way, what my work is going towards is to say, gentlemen, everyone has a wisdom tradition. We forgot that ours is the Greek. And it was closed down because of religious conflicts. We have to recognize our own source of wisdom. It's a wisdom tradition.
Well, with the rise of Christianity, there was a real effort to basically wipe out a lot of the earlier traditions that were regarded as pagan traditions filled with evil. Evil demons.
See, Christianity awakened the masses, as it were, or the segment of the population that is caught up in the drama beliefs, one kind of another, vicious beliefs. And they united them. And they made them into a colony. In other words, the least developed intellectually, they brought together into unity as a political force. And they began, therefore, with leaders who could exploit their ignorance for their own advantage, and that became called the Dark Ages.
Well, it's true that after the collapse of the Roman Empire, we entered into a phase of, 600 years or more of what we call the Dark Ages.
Yes. Matter of fact, I always enjoyed, in the past at least, reading The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Gibbons.
Yeah.
The 16th, 17th, 18th chapter of his first volume beautifully described what happened, why Christianity could be said to have been the cause of the Dark Ages. And he describes it very well. He says, in each family, people could have different beliefs about what's most important about the nature of God and themselves. Therefore, there was frictions. It brought frictions within families. Within small communities, each of the families would have different arguments and hostility towards one another. He said that spread, that hostility and the hostility against man, and
that didn't happen in the ancient world?
I don't know.
Within families? That seems sort of universal.
Well, but you see, a kingdom, the reason why a king should allow all of his people, the different segments, to live together. That's a kingdom.
Yeah.
But when one segment takes over, then that ends up being tyranny. And that has political consequences wherever it appears.
Well, tyranny was rampant in Plato's era.
And so on the other hand, Alexander created 11 Alexanders throughout the Near East. He brought an intellectual culture alive throughout the Near East. He transformed what was now considered the Holy Lands. That gave birth to all of those Gospels, the Nag Hammadi Gospels. Wherever they went, they built a Colosseum. They built a library and a gymnasium. They were forerunners in maintaining an intellectual development among their people.
Yeah. You can see amphitheaters everywhere.
When I was in the military, when we were training for southern France invasion on the beaches of southern Italy by Paestum, I used to look up and see a temple over there. And never, after that, I kept that fixed in my mind, and it still does to this day. The beauty of that Doric temple there, to Hera. And see, like, what do we do what do all our people do with their wealth? They build yachts and castles.
Yeah.
In those days, the people of wealth built temples, amphitheaters, different spirit.
Well, and it's certainly true that Athens, at its height, was, I think, one of the rulers once said, "We are the envy of the world."
Yes, yes. We are the school. The school. We are the intellectual capital of the world.
And I think they did achieve a kind of high point of intellectual brilliance.
All within 100 years. The tragedies, art, history, philosophy, mathematics. Matter of fact, they were the first people to produce a workable computer.
Oh?
They found around turn of the century, 20th century, in a shipwreck south of Italy, a curious device that was made of copper, and it had all kinds of springs, and on it, no one could figure out what it is. So about 10 years ago, an Englishman said, "You know what, I'd like to take a look at that." And he made certain kinds of analysis of it, used X-rays and other kinds of products to see what's behind and what's in this curious thing. And he decided that he was going to get brass plates, copper plates and brass, and a file and a saw, and rebuild it exactly like that.
A duplicate.
And it was an instrument that could locate all of the planets. And the key planets and the seasons of the year. Was a working computer for the heavens.
Very interesting.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
Like, they even did that? Yeah.
Well, they were clearly, for their time, a high culture, and then a great deal was lost.
Yes. Yes.
We've talked about the sacking of the library at Alexandria and so on.
Only 1 million copies.
Yeah. Well, Pierre Grimes, once again, a delightful discussion.
My pleasure. And that was a very quick summary of Philosopher
Well,
King.
I regard you as a philosopher king.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for being with me, Pierre.
My pleasure.
And I'm so delighted you came for this visit. I hope you return again.
Thank you. Again, thank you very much.
You're welcome. And thank you for being with us.
For joining us, yes.